we'll get started. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar, Genetics and Artificial Intelligence, How to Help Identify and Prevent Heart Failure. My name is Kathleen Krasnowski, and I serve as Director of Development for Feinberg School of Medicine. We are all in for a great treat today as we learn more about this exciting and emerging landscape. I'm so pleased to introduce our speaker, Dr. Jane Wilcox. Dr. Wilcox has called Northwestern her professional home for the past 16 years. She is a Northwestern alum, having completed her residency, fellowship, and master's in clinical investigation here. Today, she's Associate Professor of Medicine in the Division of Cardiology and is an expert in heart failure and heart transplantation. She also serves as Chief for the Section of Heart Failure and Recovery at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. We have a robust group today. We've got medical school alums, friends of Northwestern, and we hope you enjoy the presentation. We will have plenty of time for questions, and we'll try to get as many to them as possible. We have some submitted in advance, and any questions that you want to submit, please go to the Q&A button during the talk at the bottom of your screen. Also, closed captioning is available if you click on the CC button at the bottom. Thank you for participating today, and now I hand it off to Dr. Wilcox.
Well, thank you, Kathleen, for that kind introduction, and it's great to be here virtually with you all. And just a little bit about me. I think I'm just, honored to sort of talk with fellow alums about this role. These are my disclosures in terms of research funding and advisory board roles. But my biggest disclosure is that I'm a Badger here by only from undergrad, but I've really been at Northwestern for a long time now and sort of bleed purple, and have seen the university grow just tremendously, leaps and bounds since I started my intern year in 2007. And I'm going to share some of that with you today. But I live here in Chicago with my husband and 2 children, and have really just called Northwestern home now. All right, so let's kind of dive into the first question of what is heart failure. So I see, we've got questions that are here. Okay, perfect. So heart failure is sort of bad branding. People come into my clinic and they're like, my heart is failing. And what that really, we'll go into sort of what are the causes of heart failure, what is heart failure, but heart failure is really a syndrome it's a muscle problem. The heart is a muscle. And just like any other muscle, when you, it can become weak or stiff. And when that happens, you either have what we call systolic abnormalities or diastolic abnormalities. It can't pump strong enough to keep up with the demands of the body, or it simply can't relax well enough or provide enough blood flow to keep up with the demands of the body. And that leads to the symptomatic sort of syndrome of fatigue, congestion, water on the lungs, exercise intolerance, and shortness of breath. So heart failure is really a syndrome that is secondary to heart muscle abnormalities. Now, cardiomyopathy is a leading cause of heart failure. Now, cardiomyopathy just means heart muscle dysfunction, and its Latin origin. Here we have a healthy heart, this is the main pumping chamber, the left ventricle. It pumps out blood to the body, then blood comes back, blood to the body, then blood comes back to the right atrium, and then go to the right ventricle, and then to the lungs to get oxygenated, and then this cycle repeats. So you can have abnormalities in the left ventricle or the right ventricle that can lead to heart failure. 2 types of cardiomyopathy are hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, where the heart becomes very stiff and thick. This leads to outflow tract obstruction and inability, sort of fatigue, tired. Patients can become congested. But the biggest sort of worry here is actually sudden cardiac death. And so you hear about basketball players kind of going down during a game, or athletes having sudden cardiac death. oftentimes the underlying etiology here is hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. Dilated cardiomyopathy is another cause of heart failure. This is probably the most common that we see. And this is where the heart suffers some sort of injury, could be from a heart attack, could be from a virus, could be inherited, which we'll go over. And the heart becomes weak, dilated, and then dysfunctional. So these are sort of the different flavors of cardiomyopathy. There's another flavor called restrictive and another called non-compaction, which we won't get into, but I'm happy to answer questions in the Q&A regarding those specific types of cardiomyopathy. So as I mentioned, those cardiomyopathies or heart muscle dysfunctions can lead to congestive heart failure. And this is maybe something that you may have seen in the news, or patients say, oh, someone has congestive heart failure, CHF. This is a highly, highly morbid condition. This is, again, sort of a normal heart and then the enlarged heart, leading to this heart muscle dysfunction and the symptomatic sort of signs and symptoms: fluid around the lungs, bloated, feeling that you can't necessarily finish your meal because of stomach congestion, swollen, and cyanotic means sort of blue, not getting enough blood flow to the distal extremities. And so this is sort of the classic heart failure picture. If patients Google heart failure, it can be pretty scary. You see 50% 5-year mortality, and it's associated with a reduced quality of life. So it's really, really important that we identify these patients early on before they have what we call end-stage heart failure. There's a ton of, there's so much we can do for patients in terms of medical and device therapy that can reverse this process. And so patients, don't end up needing heart transplant, is one thing that Kathleen said I was an expert in. We only want to be an expert in a for a small number of patients who may need heart transplant or heart pumps who have end-stage heart failure. So let's dive in a little bit more into dilated cardiomyopathy, or DCM. And this is in my area of particular expertise. So dilated cardiomyopathy is not that uncommon. Like, it's, 1 in 250 people, at least in the US, have dilated cardiomyopathy. It's the most common indication for heart transplant. So not everyone, again, as I mentioned, progresses to needing heart transplant, but it's the most common indication. Dilated cardiomyopathy can usually presents in the 4th and 6th decade of life. So kind of when people are in their prime, right? 40s, 50s, and 60s. Some cases of dilated cardiomyopathy happen soon after pregnancy, and we call those peripartum cardiomyopathies. Some can be sporadic, where they just sort of happen, while others, we're learning the majority of or not, almost about 50%, 40 to 50% of dilated cardiomyopathy is actually inherited. And when I started my training at Northwestern in 2007, we sort of used the term idiopathic dilated cardiomyopathy. That was what was the diagnosis. And that just means that the doctors weren't smart enough to figure out what the cardiomyopathy was from. And it turns out over the last, 16 years, we've determined that, genetics and these DCMs are actually genetically mediated or inherited. And so that's where, most of my interest has been in. So when we talk about genetics, let's back up a little bit and do a primer on genetics. This is going to be a very high level, hopefully, don't tune out too much. But we all carry DNA variants. This is the double helix that was sequenced by Watson and Crick many years ago. And these little variants in DNA, that's what makes us unique. But, it's kind of nice to know that 99% of our genome, even more than that, is actually all the same. The human genome is 6 billion base pairs. And this tiny, tiny amount down here, approximately 3 to 4 million, what we call single nucleotide variants, that's what's different compared to our reference genome. And that's sort of, each individual person. So that's what makes us unique. But then we have what we call 200,000 rare or private variants, and those run in families. And of those rare or private variants, only 300 have what we call predicted loss of function variants. So a very small number of changes in our DNA actually can be biologically effective and cause things like cardiomyopathy or heart muscle dysfunction. So that gives us our unique fingerprint. So when we think about the code, right, we start with a recipe. I'm a big fan of Julia Child. I love to make her beef bourguignon for the holidays, for things, for our holidays that are coming up. And you start with ingredients and then you end up with sort of the final product. So really the DNA is sort of the recipe for the beef bourguignon, but DNA makes messenger RNA. RNA then makes proteins. Proteins make tissues, and tissues finally make organs that are like the heart. So if you have a rare variant, or even a few rare variants in your DNA that are passed on in generations, you can be at risk for a bad recipe, or you can be at risk for cardiomyopathy. And then when you add things to the recipe or to the organ, like high blood pressure, diabetes, coronary artery disease, high cholesterol, you add those sort of salt into the wound, into the at-risk person who's genetically at risk, that can exacerbate or lead to cardiomyopathy. So hopefully that makes sense. But when we think about these variants, phenotypic effects are sort of how severe or how soon someone would present with disease. And so someone who carries this is on this axis here, on the x-axis, we see the variant in society, in the population, being very rare, all the way to being a common variant. And this is the effect size, sort of how symptomatic the individual is going to be, or how early they might present in their disease state. And so if you have a really, really rare variant, a lot of times this causes cardiomyopathy, and this causes cardiomyopathy early in patients who might be in their, kids, or might be in their teens and 20s, as opposed to maybe more frequent variants that have an intermediate effect. So this is sort of our primer on genetics. So why would we test for these genetic variants in clinical cardiology and clinical practice? Well, why test? Because it alters our clinical diagnosis, for sure. It alters management in terms of medication and devices, in terms of exercise restriction or timing of surgery for certain types of cardiovascular conditions. We can also identify family members who are at risk and recommend appropriate surveillance intervals for them, as well as treatment. And then we can also identify family members who are not at risk. So if you do not carry that variant that was identified in a sister or a brother or mom or dad, then you can sort of be excused from lifelong surveillance, or your risk of developing that cardiomyopathy is much lower than if you carried that genetic variant. We also offer prenatal genetic counseling and pre-implantation genetic diagnoses for our patients with cardiomyopathy. And finally, it's become very cost effective and affordable for patients. Most insurance companies cover the cost of genetic testing. It's less than $2,000. And these days it runs about $250 actually out of pocket for some of these companies. So it's affordable and it alters our practice. So oftentimes patients come to me and say, okay, Dr. Wilcox, that's great. You're going to test my genetics to see if this is what's causing my cardiomyopathy. And, but what are my results? What is it going to show? And I sort of always, we start with the three little bears, right? We've got baby bear, mama bear, papa bear, but it's just really, we try to keep it simple. We've got pathogenic or disease causing, all the way to benign, where we think that this is pretty common and it's not causing the cardiomyopathy. Pathogenic means that this variant's been around, it's a bad actor, we've seen it in other families or in population databases, and it's associated with cardiomyopathy. In hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, we can identify this pathogenic variant in up to 80% of cases. In dilated cardiomyopathy, nearly half of cases. And so, it's really worthwhile to do this genetic testing. So we can either be sort of positive, disease causing, negative, not disease causing, or somewhere in the middle. And that's where I spend a lot of my time. Is this disease causing? Is this not disease causing? And this is a variant of uncertain significance. And this just means we don't know enough about the variant to say whether or not it's causative. And so it's important that these patients continue to undergo screening and that they follow with a genetic cardiologist, because as you might imagine, in 10 years, this might, or even in 5 years, the interpretation might change. So let's kind of put together, we talked about heart failure, we talked about cardiomyopathy as a cause of heart failure. It's pretty common. 1 in 250 are patients or people in the US will develop dilated cardiomyopathy. Half of cardiomyopathy is actually genetically mediated or inherited. And then when we add those things that we know are bad for you, like hypertension, diabetes, coronary artery disease, those other obesity, those other things to someone who is genetically at risk, that can bring out the phenotype of heart failure in DCM. So given all of that background, a lot of smart people got together and came up with the Dilated Cardiomyopathy Research Project. And this was born out of Ohio State with Ray Hirschberger, who's been a longtime proponent of DCM being genetically mediated. And we have a group of 25 sites across the country where I'm the principal investigator at Northwestern. And the hypothesis in this group was to really enroll families. Like, let's look at families who have cardiomyopathy and let's see if it really is genetically mediated. Are these patients and their family members just, sort of eating bad foods and having too much high blood pressure, or is this something that actually is genetically mediated? And so we are lucky enough to serve as the Echo Core Lab for this study. And so we have all of the ultrasounds or all of the echoes for this large NIH funded study. And we can understand more about dilated cardiomyopathy. And my goal is that we can prevent heart failure, prevent these family members from developing heart failure and from needing heart transplants, in the future. So out of this collaboration, out of our 25 sites, we have now enrolled 1,300 patients who have cardiomyopathy and 2,600 of their first-degree family relatives. And we've had some great publications that have come out of this. One of them was recently published in the Journal of American Medical Association, or JAMA, last year, looking at the genetic architecture of dilated cardiomyopathy in individuals of both of African and European ancestry. And one of the things of the strengths of this study is that it's very ancestrally diverse. So a lot of the reference databases that we, sort of look to say, is this DNA variant a bad actor or not? A lot of those reference data sets are built on European ancestry cohorts. And so we really want to be able to answer the question for our diverse patient population. And what this paper showed was that indeed cardiomyopathy is genetically mediated, but we're finding more of those variants of uncertain significance in patients with African ancestry, which doesn't mean that they're not disease causing. It just means that we need to do better at building these reference reference sets that are ancestrally diverse, so that we can answer questions for our diverse patient population. An additional paper that came out of this collaboration was the effectiveness of the Family Heart Talk communication tool. And so when we see patients in clinic who have cardiomyopathy, they have heart failure, I always ask about their, do you have kids? Yeah, I do have kids. Okay, well, your kids need to get an echocardiogram. Your kids, we need to do genetic testing, and they need to follow with a cardiologist. And oftentimes that really resonates with the parent who I'm seeing in clinic, or the sister or the brother. but they say, well, my family member, they're hard-headed. They say they're going to be fine. They don't have any problems, that sort of thing. So how do we engage the family as a unit to really take care of themselves and advocate for early screening, that sort of thing? And so our intervention here was a family heart talk. It was a tool to try to engage family members into getting screening. And this, we indeed showed that the uptake was higher in the patients who got the family heart talk. It wasn't perfect and we have work to do, but this is a way that we can really, again, engage that family as a unit to try to prevent heart failure. And so kind of along those lines, we talked about patients who are genetically at risk of dilated cardiomyopathy, which is not a rare condition, 1 in 250 in the US. And then let's kind of skip this here and we go all the way to the patients that I see in the hospital who have symptomatic dilated cardiomyopathy, and those are patients with heart failure. So over 6 million Americans are hospitalized every year with heart failure. So this is just the tip of the iceberg of patients who have heart failure. Then we have everything below the iceberg of patients who have cardiomyopathy or who are at risk of cardiomyopathy. So what my goal is, or a lot of our goal is, right, is to move the needle from this symptomatic phase to identifying earlier phenotypes. And because we have lots of opportunity here to intervene and start patients on disease-modifying therapies, which would be medicines, before they develop overt heart muscle dysfunction. And so this is a schematic that I put together for the grant that we were awarded to look at the ultrasounds, look at the echocardiograms of patients, the what we call the first degree family member from the patient who had this symptomatic heart failure. We were looking at their kids and their siblings to see if we could see any early signs of a pre-dilated cardiomyopathy phenotype. And the way that we did that, again, as I mentioned, we are the echocardiography core lab. So we do echocardiography, for those of you who don't know, is a fancy ultrasound that instead of telling you if you're having a girl or a boy on your obstetric ultrasound, is telling you what your heart muscle looks like on the ultrasound. And you can see here the probe is on the chest and it develops ultrasound pictures. And we use a special technique called speckle tracking echocardiography, where we look at the individual components of the heart muscle here and we see how well they're contracting. And this is called global longitudinal strain. It's an early marker, sort of a canary in the coal mine, if you will, of abnormalities in heart muscle dysfunction. And what we saw here, and this is a preview, we're still analyzing all of the data of over 3,000 echoes. But what we aimed to do, again, it was to look at all of the echoes in the first degree family members. And we looked at both the structure, like the heart muscle itself, and the function of the heart muscle. And we looked at this in over 66 families. This is just the European ancestry cohort. We didn't have this is preliminary data, so the larger data set will be more ancestrally diverse. But what we saw here is even in patients who had these variants of uncertain significance, they had abnormalities in this global longitudinal strain, even when their regular echo, their regular ultrasound may have been called normal by, sort of an outside cardiologist who may have just been looking at the echo. Yeah, that looks good. The person's fine. They're good to go. And so what this means is in patients who are genetically at risk for developing cardiomyopathy, we don't just recommend one echo and then go off and, go off into the sunset and never come back and be screened again. Those patients are definitely at risk for developing cardiomyopathy in the future, and we want to follow them. And at some point, we'll develop an intervention, either with medications or even gene editing therapy. You can see a whole host of possibilities to prevent heart failure in the future. All right, let's kind of switch gears and talk about augmented or artificial intelligence, and I promise these two overlap, and how we can use sophisticated techniques or sophisticated algorithms, including machine learning, to, again, prevent heart failure or really save patients who have heart failure. And machine learning, I mean, you don't have to be, you could, it's blown up in all areas of science. And these are just the publications in cardiovascular medicine. It's just exponential. This ends in 2020, but it keeps going up. Everyone's talking about machine learning and AI and how that can improve cardiovascular medicine and cardiovascular health. Along with the explosion in machine learning and AI, our clinical programs have had a huge growth as well in terms of our heart failure clinics. In 2020, we had 2 sites to receive heart failure care at Northwestern. And I'm pleased to say that in the last 3 years, we now have 12 advanced heart failure sites. And this is important because patients who come into Northwestern, my goal as the director of our heart failure program or cardiomyopathy program is that wherever someone enters our system, I want to make sure that they get the same level of care as if they went to, you know, the downtown campus, the same level of advanced imaging, the same access to cardiovascular genetics, and the same, you know, opportunities. And so we needed to create a platform to identify these patients and make sure that we're standardizing care. And so I'll go into that in a couple of slides. But a little bit of a primer first on machine learning or augmented intelligence for cardiovascular medicine. And this slide is a little busy, but I'm gonna go to the top here. We have two types of machine learning, and machine learning just means that you're able to handle large amounts of data, and you run it through you know, the machine, the computer, but algorithms that can help to clarify or improve your model prediction. And so you can either do supervised machine learning, which you have a labeled training data set here, where you have outcomes that are pre-specified, like patients dying or being readmitted for heart failure. And then you look for patterns that predict known outcomes and run it through a test data set. So this is sort of if like we know what's going on, we run it through this supervised machine learning. Unsupervised machine learning is when you have a large amount of data and you really don't know what's going on and you're trying to find patterns in the data set. So there's two broad types of machine learning. All of these can help in cardiovascular medicine. They can help with trial design, with diagnosis, with classification. So where unsupervised machine learning has helped a lot is in the area of heart failure with preserved ejection fraction, where we haven't had a lot of therapies for this. And this helps to develop new phenotypes or classifications in heart failure. It can help with prediction algorithms, as well as you know, device therapy or medical titration therapy. So a lot of aspects can be applicable in cardiovascular medicine of machine learning. The importance here, I put this in because, you know, you can see the publications soaring. What hasn't gone along with that, honestly, has been necessarily training in AI. So a lot of people can, you know, put data into these supercomputers or use these algorithms and then try to publish work. The importance of this, though, is that you are training the next generation of leaders who understand artificial intelligence and apply this in a way that's going to be meaningful. And one of the awesome things at Northwestern now is that we have this Masters of Science of Artificial Intelligence, MSAI, that is in our Center for Artificial Intelligence in the Bloom Cardiovascular Institute. And this paper was written by Ramsey Waby, who was one of my advanced heart failure fellows, gosh, 3 or 4 years ago. And he got his master's in AI and is now leading the field, and you know, is well trained. And one of the things he always talks about is, if regular statistics, can do the job, we don't necessarily always need AI. And so AI, again, really helps to find patterns in data when you don't know what's going on. We use AI in large data sets. In Echo, actually, you can see here that when you're measuring values here, this is one of the values we use in our echocardiogram called ejection fraction. So this is the reference value here. This was someone who read the echo, a cardiologist. And here, this is the predicted algorithm. And you can see here that they perform pretty well. So these artificial, machines are going to be taking our job, I guess. Maybe I say that facetiously, but they perform pretty well. And what that allows us to do is look at data sets across health systems and identify patients who may be at risk for certain types of cardiomyopathies, and get them the right care that they need. So how did we do this at Northwestern? This is before Northwestern, or before Twitter was moved to X, but this is a tweet from the NHLBI, the National Institutes of Health, that said researchers are now studying how artificial intelligence can be used to identify adults at increased risk for heart failure who may benefit from early detection and timely treatment of care. And this is my faculty, Josh Chima, who also has his master's in artificial intelligence. And he and I and others have worked on this platform to try to close gaps that may exist in a health system, and identify patients who may be sliding towards having advanced heart failure, right? So they need the right care at the right time. How do we identify those patients and get them plugged in? And this is important because, you can do all the research in the world, but and find all these scientific advancements, but if you don't implement it, right? If you don't check the blood pressure, if patients don't have access to care, if things are too expensive for patients, none of those things actually get implemented. And so there are a ton of reasons for this implementation gap. Sometimes doctors don't know about new therapies. There may be patient and caregiver awareness issues. Again, patient costs an arm, some of these drugs can cost an arm and a leg if you don't have secondary drug prescription coverage. So there are a lot of implementation gaps that exist, and AI is simply a way to overcome a component of that. And that may be either the clinician knowledge or the patient awareness, or, the patient had symptoms that weren't really identified as heart failure. And so AI is, again, a piece of the puzzle, a way to improve things, from one standpoint. And one of the things and this is what we did at Northwestern. So what we developed was a model for patients who had advanced heart failure. So there are a lot of things that go into, progressive shortness of breath, laboratory abnormalities, imaging characteristics, laboratory abnormalities that could identify a patient who might be at high risk. So we have all of our patients are linked on our Healthy Planet Heart Failure Registry. We also have this large enterprise data warehouse that we can mine the data, and we put this into our modeling techniques, which is sort of our, stirring of the recipe. So this data goes into the model, which is iterative, and it generates a report. And this, again, we verified this model with human review. So it's not only the machines taking over, but we had a nurse clinician who is looking over these reports that are generated. And then we would reach out to patients and say, we think that you might be at risk for developing advanced heart failure. We'd like to see you in one of our clinics. And what did this do for us? And these are the data. We looked at over 55,000 patients who had heart failure, who were identified as having heart failure in our system at Northwestern. We then created this workbench report of 7,000 patients, and then had a nurse coordinator review about 1,700 patients. This is a very simple slide for a lot of work that was done, but it was iterative in the way that we could develop the model to become better and better and identify these patients. And so our nurse has to review less and less. But of these patients, all seen at Northwestern, what I would consider a world-class system, right? A world-class care, we ended up opening 11 what we call advanced therapies evaluations, where we thought patients would benefit from either transplant or LVAD. We ended up implanting 3 patients with a heart pump that saved their lives, and 2 patients underwent heart transplant that would not have been otherwise identified in our system for needing a heart transplant. And then importantly, we had 57 patients who didn't need a heart transplant or an LVAD, but they might have needed a stent or a valve or a pacemaker, and they were referred to other specialties, other specialists in our Bloom Cardiovascular Institute. And then all patients were optimized on heart failure evidence-based care. So I think this is just a really nice example of how artificial intelligence is really augmented intelligence, and how it can build not only clinical operations, but can sort of serve as big brother in a health system to ensure that patients are getting the care that they need. I'll finish up here with just a plug for our HeartShare program. I mentioned that heart failure with preserved ejection fraction is a huge unmet need in cardiovascular medicine. A lot of these patients have shortness of breath, reduced quality of life, high morbidity and mortality, and sort of very few treatment options. And HeartShare is a $7 million grant that was awarded to Dr. Sanjeev Shah, who's one of my partners. It's funded by a private partnership, but with NHLBI. And it's centered around this data hub, or where the goal is really to take a ton of data, again, that's including imaging, blood, genetics, tissue data, and put that all in our hub and use advanced analytic techniques to try to improve care for these HFpEF or heart failure with preserved patients. And these are the sites across the country. Northwestern is the data coordinating site. There are 3 aspects of this study. It's retrospective, where we're really just harmonizing all of this data. Then we've got 5 years of deep phenotyping, recruiting individuals with heart failure and doing all of these tests to identify disease subtypes in the future that can really be personalized care for heart failure patients. These are the current tools that we're using in the protocol. So anywhere from like basic EKGs, which are the electrodes that go on your chest, to really detailed tissue biopsies, exercise testing. So all of these tools will be integrated into the HeartShare protocol, and we will use machine learning and AI to try to find these subtypes of heart failure. So there's just a ton of potential for AI and heart failure. I won't go into these all. This is actually, I put this into ChatGPT and it generated this slide for me. So watch out, college professors. I'm sure you're dealing with this all the time, where papers are being generated in ChatGPT, but a huge area of unmet need where AI can actually improve not only diagnosis recognition, but also build your clinical operations and get patients into the appropriate care pathways. One of the questions I'll finish up here is that I'm asked a fair amount is, how can I, as an alum or as someone who's interested in AI or interested in genetics, how can I accelerate impact, still at Northwestern? And that's really 3 ways. One is supporting the growth of the team, the people who are doing the work. The second is to develop infrastructure for these pragmatic trials. The third is model development. And so this is sort of investing in the infrastructure on the back end, not necessarily the clinicians who are doing the work, but all of the analysts and support staff that are helping to drive our initiatives. So with that, I'll thank you for your time, and I'm happy to answer any questions. I know this was sort of a whirlwind all the way from what is heart failure to AI, but I think you can see that there's definitely a continuum to preventing disease and then identifying patients who have advanced disease, and all the way in between.
Thank you, Dr. Wilcox. We have had a lot of questions come in today during your talk, and we have a lot from the submissions. So let's get right to them. The first group is around genetics. So do you think genetic testing will eventually be affordable enough to include it in routine testing in order to maximize its utility in large-scale machine learning models?
So that's a great question. I think genetic testing is definitely available. We use it in our cardiovascular clinics all the time. You can use commercially available panels that are, if you bring a credit card, it's $250. Where the expense comes is, having someone interpret those test results and having an expert in the clinic that can sort of walk you through what all of that means. There are platforms that exist. These, you can go online and 23andMe, you get sort of, I'm at risk for this. I have patients who come in and say, gosh, but that is what's using what's called genome-wide association, looking for common variants that might put you at just an increase, a little bit of risk. But the clinical testing that we use is we use like a 200 cardiomyopathy gene panel. So this is much more focused testing. The second part of that question was like maybe how AI can help, Kathleen, is that right? Yeah, so I think we're doing this at Northwestern as well. We have NewGene, which is a program where all of the genetic, you can if someone approaches you to join NewGene, please do. So we have all of the electronic health records coupled with genetic testing results. And so we can use AI to sort of make inferences there.
Thank you. What do you recommend for routine genetic testing and family cascade screenings for the following? So DCM, restrictive cardiomyopathy, left ventricular non-compaction, and HCM.
Perfect. So if, first of all, you want to make sure that you're seeing a specialist who is dealing with this. And if what we call it the proband, so the person who's affected, so let's say mom has hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, HCM. And honestly, they apply to all the conditions. So if they have DCM, HCM, non-compaction, and we do genetic testing in mom, and we find a bad actor, we find a disease-causing variant, a pathogenic variant, then if mom's the center of the bike wheel, we go to all spokes around mom. So that'd be siblings, brothers and sisters, and children, and parents if they're still alive. So everybody who has a first-degree connection to mom needs both genetic testing and clinical testing. So you can't just get one or the other. So you have to get, I would recommend they all get an echocardiogram, and that they would all be tested, not for the broad panel that we tested mom, but we would test for that site-specific variant. And if they're positive, then, we look at the echo, and if the echo is normal, then we would do yearly echoes in them over time, kind of like you're screened for breast cancer or colon cancer. It's not just one time, you have to do it, over several years. And if the first degree relative is negative, then they still get a clinical echo to make sure that everything's okay. But that sometimes releases them from needing ongoing screening. And then their kids would not need to be tested as well, that negative individual. So hopefully that makes sense.
A lot. Thank you. What disease modifiers are you utilizing for those deemed to have genetic risk of heart failure? They list diet, exercise, SGLT2
inhibitors. Very nice. Yes.
ACE, ARB, and others.
Yep. So I see a ton of these patients, right, who come in and they have a family history or they are genetically at risk, and we see these subtle abnormalities. Those are patients where I start that but also, other experts in the field would start them on an ACE or an ARB, sort of medications that are, if you Google them or look them up in the physician's drug reference, they're going to say blood pressure medicines. But what they're doing is they're actually helping the heart muscle improve. And those are medicines. There are 4 pillars of medicines that we use. One is called the beta blocker. The other is an ARNI compound or ARB. The third is a mineralocorticoid receptor antagonist. And the fourth is this SGLT2 inhibitor or Jardiance or Farxiga that you may have heard on, seen on commercials. But what those do is the kidney sort of sends these nasty signals to the heart over time, which causes the heart to get enlarged and dysfunctional. And if you block those signals, then the heart can remodel and get better. So the thought is if we give those medicines to patients early enough who are at risk, not just everybody, but the at-risk patients, we can prevent the progression of heart failure.
That is great. So another heart failure question. For unexplained sudden cardiac death without exercise at 30 to 40 years of age, and it's a familial, what specific genetic and cardiac testing is needed in other family members? I'm sorry if you already kind of answered that.
No, that's okay. I think this is tough, right? If you have a family member who had sudden death, the first thing is you always want to know, was an autopsy performed? And if so, bringing that autopsy report to your cardiologist is important. If they had unexplained sudden cardiac death, I would recommend an ultrasound, an echocardiogram for their relative. I'd recommend a heart monitor, something called a Holter monitor for a period of time to look for arrhythmias. And we may consider doing genetic testing to see if we found one of those really bad actors of those certain genes are more what we call arrhythmogenic or likely to cause heart rhythm problems.
Thanks. Another question, any new medications for diastolic dysfunction in diabetic cardiomyopathy?
Yes. So that fourth medicine I talked about, the SGLT2 inhibitor, Jardiance or Farxiga are the 2 trade names. Those are both now approved for diastolic cardiomyopathy or heart failure with preserved EF. So patients who have problems like a stiff heart, problems relaxing, the SGLT2 inhibitor was shown to reduce symptoms and improve mortality, and patients felt better, died less, were hospitalized less. Important things for heart failure patients. So that's definitely recommended for all of our heart failure with preserved EF and diabetic cardiomyopathy patients.
Thanks. This is a question about causation and connection. Is there causation and connection between coronary artery disease and heart failure?
Yes. So half of all heart failure is this dilated cardiomyopathy. The other half is heart failure with reduced ejection fraction. The other half is due to coronary disease. So, 30 years ago, people would just die from their heart attack. Now people are surviving due to advancements in care. But after a heart attack, patients are at risk for heart muscle dysfunction or heart failure. So it's important that, if you had a heart attack or your loved one had a heart attack, it's not just, oh gosh, I survived that. It's you need to be on medications to prevent your heart from getting worse in the future, in addition to not having another heart attack.
Thank you. So this is going now more down the road of AI, and these kind of go in tandem, these 2 questions. What do you think about these AI algorithms and CVD prediction? What challenges do we face to adopt those? And what is the current industry and regulatory body, like the FDA, acceptance level on leveraging AI for diagnosing and treating heart disease?
So I think these 2 questions kind of go hand. I like that because it's sort of like, we need to be careful, or what are the guardrails with AI, right? And that's where I kind of wanted to stress that we really are thinking about it as augmented intelligence. This is not rise of the machines and, doctors are no longer needed. Where AI can be helpful is in large data sets. So FDA, the National Institutes of Health, are very interested in how we can identify patterns, or we can identify patients who might respond to certain therapies using AI. But what that does first is AI can identify that, and then the scientist or the expert or the drug company, then develops the care pathway or the right thing for that patient. So that's where I see AI as being really useful, is to help when we don't really know what's going on. And we can use that anywhere from in health systems to all the way through, in populations. So it can help to identify things and also help to, move patients into the appropriate care pathway.
Thanks. Another AI question was about AI and if it can help with preventing stroke, which is common.
Yes. Yeah. So, I guess I'm wearing an Apple Watch, and AI, and various other companies, have AI algorithms to detect atrial fibrillation, which is a common arrhythmia in people as we get older, or have hypertension. It's the leading cause for stroke. So the Apple Watch can actually alert you that that you may have atrial fibrillation and that you should see your doctor. And we have a study here at Northwestern that is led by Dr. Rod Passman, where it's using an Apple Watch or using AI technology. If you go into AFib, you actually would take a blood thinner to prevent stroke. So it's personalized, using AI to prevent stroke. So that's a great question.
Interesting. Will there be AI ways that at-risk patients on their own, perhaps with the preparation and guidance of doctors, but without the doctor being right there, that they can even monitor or diagnose heart health? I think that kind of goes with the last question you said. So they're using the Apple Watch with AI for AFib, but do you see that transcending into any of the other areas of heart health?
Yeah, I think so. I think, one of the things what we do in heart failure as well is, the steps that are tracked, or your overall trends of, you're moving less than you moved last year. I got one of those the other day. That was great. But those types of trends are really useful in, if you're seeing someone in clinic and you say, how are you feeling? Oh, I'm feeling the same as last year, doc, no change. But actually these biometric trends are changing. And so, any objective data that maybe AI generated is always better than the subjective, I'm feeling about the same, because that actually could be the disease is sneakily getting worse.
I hadn't thought of it that way. That's great. I have another one about hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. So with a negative result in genetic testing, do you still recommend direct family members to get cardio ultrasound testing?
Absolutely. Just because we didn't find it on genetic testing doesn't mean it's not genetically mediated. So it just means we haven't found it yet. So if let's go back to mom, it's always mom. If mom has hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, we do genetic testing in mom, and mom is negative, or she gets a variant of uncertain significance. That just means that we don't do genetic testing in the family. We still do clinical screening in the family. Everybody still gets an ultrasound. And for kids who are growing, the kids, if mom's brother who's 75 gets an ultrasound and it looks fine, okay, fine, he's done. But if the kids and the grandkids get an echo and, it's still normal, it doesn't obviate them from needing screening every 3 to 5 years, especially as they're growing, because their echo may change.
Thanks. Here's
Sure.
another one that's got roller coasters, so I wanted to read it. So this person was told with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy that they're not to play basketball, not to run, not to do any races, and not to go on roller coasters. And they want to know why, especially why they can't go on a roller coaster.
That seems like very specific advice.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know this exact situation.
It is a fair question to you since you don't even know this patient.
Yeah, I don't actually know the physiology, but my guess is that the septum, the heart is very thick, and it is at risk of not what we would call preload dependent, where it needs a certain amount of blood to be, in the cavity to be pumped out each time. And if it's not there, then you could have more obstructive symptoms. And as you might imagine, you're going upside down, you're going up and down, your blood volumes change. And so their doctor may be concerned about the obstructive symptoms coming out.
Thank you.
Sure.
Another one, how does philanthropy help with your type of research?
Immensely. I think, philanthropy it helps with with developing that pilot data that is so important. I've talked a lot about our big NIH, our government funded grants that are like sort of prestigious and also, lots of money, and help our institutions. But in order to get those big grants, you have to have pilot data that you submit. And so for these pilot projects, it's super important to have philanthropy partner with that. And that's how I've actually been able to develop a lot of my work. Is I've had some grateful patients or just interested patients who are interested in cardiomyopathy and wanted to help. And so I'm very grateful for the partners that I've had over the years.
Thanks. And I think we're about 2 minutes to our end. So I wanted to ask one final question, which is the gestalt here. How long before these therapies catch up to diagnostics? Identifying the issue is really only as valuable if the therapy can be applied.
Yes. So absolutely, we have, that could be another hour of all
Yes,
of the
sure.
novel therapeutics that we have. Gene editing is here. We have ways to develop drugs into the myocardium. We have peptides and these small little viruses that can do gene editing. And so that is exponentially moving forward. But we also have we have really good heart failure medication therapy and device therapy, which I didn't really touch on. And so once we can get a patient into our clinic, it's not all doom and gloom. I see, a ton of patients who can actually recover their heart muscle function with the 4 pillars of medication therapy, with device-based therapy, with valve interventions, with all sorts of, new therapeutics in heart failure. But we just have to see those. We have to be able to see them early enough, not when they're way too sick.
Sure. Well, thank you for this overview and for answering all of our questions that we were able to get to today. And thank you to the participants for staying through the end. And we just are thankful for all that you're doing for this current generation and generations to come. So thank you.
Thanks so much for having me, Kathleen.
Thanks.
Thanks,
Bye-bye,
everybody.
everyone. Bye-bye.